The Mummy. 1999's The Mummy, starring our golden boy, Brendan Fraser. The Mummy is really an ode to that era of fiction that Dungeons & Dragons grew out of, right? It is pulp fantasy, sword and sorcery nonsense. We have our sword-wielding hero. At one point, that sword-wielding hero says this:
"Rescue the damsel in distress, kill the bad guy, and save the world."
Oh.
And that quote is a hallmark of pulp magazines. We have this pervasive element of almost eldritch horror that occurs throughout the movie. This kind of like gross monsters and body horror. And I think that is something that early Dungeons & Dragons, and even Dungeons & Dragons nowadays, but not so much nowadays, but something that early Dungeons & Dragons did a lot of was that, like, gross out, disgusting dungeon. There are monsters that look like stalactites, and there are monsters that are sharks with legs, right? Just, like, ridiculous things that kind of horrify you. And we have this kind of good to amoral aspect of the movie, and so The Mummy is very much a part of that era, even though it was made kind of after that era was on its decline. And it literally kind of feels like one of those early D&D modules, right? I think if you've read through any of those, you'll kind of get where I'm going with this. And even the characters themselves feel like D&D classes. We have Rick O'Connell, who seems very much like a barbarian. We have Jonathan Carnahan, who is pretty much a thief, right? He's like not very good in a fight, but he is stealing things all the time. He is the one who kind of kicks off the quest with something that he stole, right? And then Evelyn Carnahan, to me, very much a wizard. And I'll explain what I mean, because some of you might be saying, that doesn't make sense. But she's learned, she's a scholar, she reads spells from ancient tomes multiple times through the movie, right? AKA a spell book. So she really is kind of the wizard of the story. Or maybe she is a martial class with like some magic added. But this is even like a better D&D movie, or at least like a better classic D&D movie than other D&D movies that came out during, I think, that same year or the years around it.
So I take that spear, I fire, I through her.
So I think all of that will make it a very good movie to learn from. It's not something that I want to copy beat for beat. I think if you were making a campaign out of this, you would be very successful, right? It has a lot of aspects of, like I said, those classic D&D modules, and but like kind of modernized, right? So I want to see what we can learn, and I think The Mummy shows us that we can have good stories with drama and action, and things can still feel fun, right? There's like that classic joke that we see of dungeon masters wanting a serious campaign, and then it ends up like Monty Python. But I think The Mummy is that serious campaign where things are fun, things are dramatic, tense, all those story buzzwords, right? And you're still like not taking it too seriously, right? It doesn't feel like work to get through it. It feels like you are having fun to get through it, but you're still motivated. So all those reasons, I think we have a lot to learn from. But before we see what we can learn, let's go through the characters just as a little refresher real quick, right? I'm sure not everyone watched the movie in preparation of watching this video, so let's go through the characters. We have Imhotep, aka the Mummy, right? The person that the movie is named after. Very important character. Then we have Rick O'Connell, Brendan Fraser's character. We have Evelyn Carnahan, Rachel Weisz's character. We have Jonathan Carnahan, I forgot the actor's name. We have Benny Gabor, I forgot the actor's name. And then we have the Medhai, I forgot all of the actors' names because there's a lot of them. And just for those that don't know, the Medhai aren't actually named in the movie. I got their name off of the Mummy Wikipedia page. I'm guessing they're mentioned in some of the comics or something like that, or maybe one of the later movies, I don't remember. But the Medhai are the group that are guarding the tomb, and they are trying to stop the mummy from being raised. So they are the people who fight Rick O'Connell's garrison in the beginning of the movie, and they are the people that fight the group on the boat, Rick O'Connell and his group again, right? They're basically just trying to kill Rick O'Connell throughout the movie until they aren't, right? And then they switch sides. We'll talk about that more later. But let's talk about what we, as writers, making games for our players, campaigns for our players, narratives for our players, can learn from this movie to better equip ourselves. Something that I really liked about this movie was that they used the sense of progress very well. And that sounds ambiguous, right? But they used progression to keep things feeling alive throughout the movie, despite this movie being about the undead, right? I think that oftentimes in Dungeons and Dragons games, everything feels very static. Things don't feel like they are progressing in the world. They don't feel like they are moving in the world, but things feel like they are moving in this world. They feel very alive, or in this movie, right? They feel very alive. Something I see a lot of times in Dungeons and Dragons is that the villain is just kind of waiting around for the heroes to level up or get that magical item, right, in order to stop that villain. But in this movie, the villain is making progress. He is very likely to defeat the heroes, right? He has a strong upper hand, and the heroes are learning as much as they can, leveling themselves up, kind of. I mean, they aren't leveling up like we do, but they are learning more and gaining new skills throughout the movie. And that makes things feel more alive than kind of that static, classic, or maybe not classic, but that static D&D campaign where the villain is just waiting around, right? So I like that a lot. And throughout the movie, the villain grows. And throughout the movie, the heroes learn, right? It's kind of like a race to whatever's going on. And even when you look at the dungeon, right, the City of the Dead, Hamunaptra, it is progressing as well. I think oftentimes in D&D, we have our dungeon, and we have our 14 rooms, right? And maybe room 1 has goblins, and room 7 has, I don't know, a dark mantle or something. And we go through each room, and each room is like a little loot box, right? But the dungeon itself doesn't really change. And in this movie, the dungeon changes every time we see the dungeon, right? The first time we see it is with Rook O'Connell's garrison, and things are very dormant. We see a little bit of the curse, but the biggest threat there are the Medhai themselves. Then the next time we see it awakening. We see the curses manifesting as, I think, locusts or something else like that. And then we have the warnings of the Medhai. We have the mummy waking up. We have his thralls waking up. And so now the dungeon is an active city, right? And then we leave it, and then the next time we come back, there's a ritual going on. So every time we see this location, something different is happening. It is not a static location like a lot of our locations are in Dungeons and Dragons. We plan, like I said, our rooms, and then once those rooms have been gone through, that's kind of it. And something else I liked about Hamunaptra and Cairo, right, the city that they begin in, the city in Egypt, is that the locations are so large that the players have no chance, or I guess in this case the main characters, have no chance of ever seeing all of them. So they have to be precious with their time. And that is something else that makes it feel more alive, is just the expanse of what could be seen. They could get lost. The movie would have been a great movie if they had gone into Hamunaptra, gotten lost, had to defeat the mummy in the tomb, right? You could have had almost like a Tomb Raider type movie, and it would have been a good movie. That's not the direction they decided to go, and I think they went in a good direction. I don't know if that movie would have been as good, but in each situation, the story would have felt alive because of how the location is treated. And so that is something that I think adding progress to our locations, adding an evolution to our locations, adds that sense of that location feeling alive. We even see this in Cairo. The first time we see Cairo, we see it in the daylight, right? And there's lots going on. There are merchants, there's hustle and bustle. And then the next time we see it, it is night. It is very quiet. Not much is going on until the mummy awakens it in the same way Hamunaptra was awakened. We see kind of a parallel to that progress, to that evolution that we saw before. And now there are zombie thralls running around town, right? So the city itself changes. And this makes things just feel more alive, rather than having stagnant locations, stagnant villains, having locations that progress with your story, villains that progress with your story. Just make things feel more alive in the campaign. Make it really feel like things are happening. So that's the first thing I noticed about this movie. The second thing I noticed about this movie is there is almost always a timetable. They use timetables very well in this movie to add tension throughout the movie. So even when there is something as simple as travel, when they're on the boat out of Cairo, we see Jonathan Carnahan gambling with, I guess we'll call them the Rowdy Americans. I don't know if they actually have names in that movie, but they are Americans and they are rowdy, so that's what they will be. And Rick O'Connell comes up and they bet Rick O'Connell that they will get there first, right? They put gold on the table. And so now they aren't just traveling to Hamunaptra, they are trying to beat the Americans to Hamunaptra, to the city of the dead, right? They're trying to get there first. Now we have this race across the desert, and for players, we have them spending resources, spending exhaustion points, right? Now, when they do have something that sets them back, it is much more of a setback than it would have been before, because oftentimes when we're traveling in Dungeons and Dragons, we kind of expect to have some fun encounter on the way. We expect to have something attack us on the road that is hopefully related to the story. But in this, they put a timetable on it, and it doesn't always have to be gold, right? It could be that they're trying to get somewhere before something happens. They're trying to get someone to the herbalist or something before that person is taken by whatever disease they're experiencing, but now travel is much more interesting than it would have been. And they even do this the second time they travel back to Hamunaptra. They have to get to Hamunaptra before the ritual is conducted, right? Evelyn has been kidnapped. They are trying to get there to stop it, and so they are racing against the clock once again. And even the villain himself is on a timetable. He is trying to conduct whatever ritual he needs to conduct before the heroes get there, right? So he's racing against the clock. The heroes are racing against his clock. There's a race of clocks, right? But the heroes are trying to get to the mummy before he becomes immortal. The Mid-High warn them that the mummy will eventually become immortal. So everything in this movie, even down to travel, like I mentioned, is put on some sort of timetable so that the heroes are racing against it. So that is something that I liked a lot. It's something that I think is a pretty easy way to add tension to a game, rather than having the heroes like sit around and ha. Now they have to get somewhere fast. They need to spend resources. They need to spend exhaustion points, right? And it kind of goes back to that idea of organic progression throughout the story, right? When you're racing against the clock, you are kind of you're forcing yourself into progress. But let's talk about the next thing I liked. The next thing I really liked is that great villains are weak. Or at least they have weaknesses. I think that villains need weaknesses in the same way that heroes need weaknesses. In order to have like good, complex characters, you need weaknesses. And if the villain doesn't have weaknesses, you kind of end up with a Mary Sue kind of situation where the hero needs to be very strong in order to defeat the villain, right? Because the villain is so strong. And then when you do get to the defeat of the villain, you end up in these situations where it's kind of like a wave of the hand, or the villain's weakness is like friendship all along or something like that. And it's something that doesn't really fit in the story. Not that you can't fit the villain's weakness being friendship into a story, but it gets very wave of the hand when the villain doesn't have any weaknesses. And this movie does weaknesses very well because the weaknesses grow over time, or I guess they diminish over time, right? So the first time we see the mummy, Rick O'Connell blasts him with a shotgun and he is dazed, or he he's stunned somehow. He falls off some cliff or something, and Rick O'Connell says, well, I defeated the mummy. And the Mid-High say, he is immortal. You cannot defeat him unless you do this really specific thing. And so we have that early weakness of just the hero's weapon, right? Pretty standard, easy weakness to have, and something that I like a lot more as a introduction to a villain than what I see in a lot of D&D games, which is the villain just kind of like smacking the heroes down and saying, well, I don't have to worry about you because you are too weak for me, and so I will leave you in this inn with your legs broken and your heads shattered. And then the heroes get nursed back to health and they go after the villain. And I don't know, I kind of like to put my heroes in situations where they have a possibility of winning. Having that situation where the villain just smacks them down over and over again, because you kind of need the heroes to like see the villain multiple times throughout the story in order for the heroes to really be going after that villain. And so if every time the heroes see him, the villain just smacks them down, it kind of just gets annoying after a while. And so I like the way they do it in The Mummy, where again, they start small and they get to stronger and stronger tools, right? The second tool that they have is just a cat, which is ironically better than a gun, right? I guess cat beats gun and mummy beats cat. No, I don't know. But cat beats gun, right? And then they use the cat to scare the villain, because the cat is in the Mummy's Egyptian mythology like the guardian of the dead or something. Or he's the guardian to the doorway or the river. I should have wrote that down. I didn't, though. So I don't remember. But they're using a cat now, right? And then when they get to the end, they are using the Book of Amun-Ra. And so now they are taking over the Mummy's thralls. And so the Mummy's thralls are now against him. And so they are slowly building up tools throughout the story, many of which are temporary, which I really like. Temporary. Warriors are very, like, temporary throughout the movie, so they can use the gun for a while, and then they can use the cat for a while, and then they're going to be able to use the book for a while, and hopefully that will last long enough that they're able to defeat the villain, right? So they are given tools through the world to fight back against the villain, and the villain is weak to those tools, but he is not so weak to those tools that those tools can defeat him. So it's this back and forth of the hero's weaknesses and the villain's weaknesses, and it is done very well, and I think that we can learn from it. The last thing I liked in this movie, or at least the last main thing, was the secondary antagonists, the way that they dealt with the secondary antagonists, because the secondary antagonists of this movie kind of weave their way through the story, and they're changing sides, and we're talking about like the merchant, we're talking about Benny Gabor, we're talking about the Medhai, and we're talking about the Rowdy Americans. The Rowdy Americans are kind of more like rivals than anything, because they're kind of going, they aren't directly attacking the main characters, but they are going after the same things the main characters are going after. They're having those parallel goals, and so now, we kind of go back to the idea of timetables with the Rowdy Americans. They are racing against those Americans to get whatever they're trying to get, right? And then as the story progresses, those Americans are now working with the main characters. And so they're weaving their way back to a different side, a different alliance through the story. And we see this with the other secondary antagonists. The merchant himself is in it for himself throughout the movie, but he is working with the group like partway through his own story, right? And so he starts just as someone who wants to keep Rick O'Connell locked up because Rick O'Connell owes him money or something. I forget. And then, Prismo, what's out there? Something's out there. And then he is working with the group, right? Kind of a small secondary antagonist, but it gives us the inklings of what the how many times can I say secondary antagonists? It gives us inklings of what that secondary antagonist will be like throughout the movie. The next big one is Benny Gabor, right? He's working with Rick O'Connell's garrison, and then he's working with the Rowdy Americans, and then he's working with the Mummy. He is changing sides throughout the Mummy, and something I really liked about Benny Gabor is oftentimes dungeon masters, and I see a lot of dungeon masters talking about this on like forums and whatnot, is that they really want to have like a double cross in their games. They want to have some great altruistic, helpful character that then double crosses the players for whatever reasons. And so I think a lot of players become very skeptical of very helpful players. Or very helpful NPCs. They think that helpful NPCs are a trap, and they rightly should think that helpful NPCs are a trap, right? No help is free. And so when people say that they will just help them with, without asking anything in the return, it's kind of suspicious. But the thing about Benny Gabor is that he is suspicious throughout the movie. You know that he is going to double-cross everyone. You are just waiting for it to happen. Rick O'Connell knows that he is going to double-cross everyone. He even throws him off the boat, right? And that is something that I like a lot more, because having that bit of foreshadowing of what a character is going to do kind of makes things more suspenseful. The main characters kind of know that they need Benny Gabor in some situations, but they don't want to need him because they know that he's going to double cross them at some point, and they are just waiting for the double cross. And having that tension, that suspense of the main characters, our players, waiting for that double cross is something I like a lot more than just a sudden, this guy is suddenly bad, right? This altruistic character is suddenly bad. So that is something that I liked a lot. And then the last secondary antagonist, at least the last one I'm talking about, the Medhai. The Medhai keep the same goal throughout the movie, but it is the main characters' motivations that change. That is something that I like a lot. They are fighting against the Medhai, and then they are allying with the Medhai. And so we have, once again, people changing sides, changing alliances, weaving their way through the story as it progresses. And that's something that I liked a lot, and something that Prismo is tired of talking about. But that's okay, because we are on the last couple things, small things that I liked in the movie. Something that I liked a lot was just the awesome boss fight. Not really narrative related, but the boss fight in The Mummy doesn't really make sense. The fight with the Mummy doesn't really make sense. They are in a city of the dead that has been sitting dormant for probably thousands of years, right? And then Rick O'Connell cuts a rope and zip lines up to the top of some scaffolding. Why is that scaffolding there? Did they stop building it midway? Why is the rope rot resistant for thousands of years? Doesn't really make sense. Why is there a pit of souls? The pit of souls is never explained, but it's a lot of fun, right? We get to throw the bad guy into it in the end. And so we have these things that don't really make sense for the location, don't really make sense for what's going on, but they're definitely fun, right? They make sense enough. They pass the refrigerator test, if you're familiar with the refrigerator test. Maybe I'll just put it in text right there. So that's something that I liked. It was a reminder we don't always need things to make sense exactly, and that is kind of the one of the things I like about this movie is, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really take itself too seriously. It has drama, it has tension, it has a good story, but it also is just a lot of fun. And this is one of those aspects of them just making things a lot of fun. And I think that the other thing about this movie is that there's just always room for action. D&D is kind of a tactical RPG, and The Mummy definitely teaches us that there is always room for some crazy encounter to go on. Every encounter, it seems like, in this movie, if it were a campaign, is a step up from the last. The first time they're fighting, they are, at least when they're fighting and it's not the prologue, they're fighting some mummies, and then they are fighting huge groups of zombie thralls, and then they are fighting, I guess the first encounter is the Medhai, right? So the first encounter is just normal guys. And then we have normal dead guys. And then we have not normal undead guys. We have the zombie thralls in Cairo, and then we have the thralls in the tomb again, but these are kitted out thralls with swords. They are undead sorcerers, although they don't really use any magic, right? And so there's always room for action. It is always a step up from whatever happened last. That's something that I liked a lot, and something that I think that we can learn from. So a lot to learn from this movie. I think that that makes sense because it is in that sword and sorcery vein. If there's something I missed, of course, let me know. You know where. It's the comments. On this channel, I try to look at methods of writing through the lens of tabletop gaming to become a better writer for my tabletop and help others become a better writer for their tabletop. So if that's something that you want to stick around for, then please stick around for it. My name is Wes. My dog's name is Prismo. Thank you so much for watching this video, and see you next time. Heroes, I think, man,